On my 45th birthday, I walked into my best friend's apartment and found my husband's hand tangled in her hair, his mouth on her neck, both of them too lost in each other to hear the door open. Matthew didn't flinch. He didn't scramble for an excuse or a shirt. He just looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room, mildly annoyed at the interruption. 5 years later at my cousin's wedding, he would smirk at me across a crowded reception hall and tell me that leaving me was the best decision he ever made. He had no idea what was about to happen. But that night, 5 years earlier, I didn't know any of that either. I only knew the smell of the roast chicken cooling on my kitchen counter, the 2 wine glasses I'd set out, and the quiet that had settled over my house like dust. I'd spent the morning at Fort Belvoir running a logistics review that left me with a headache behind my left eye, but I'd told myself the whole drive home that tonight wasn't about work. Tonight was about turning 45 with the 2 people I loved most outside my uniform. My husband of 11 years and Emily, the woman who'd been my closest friend since college. The one who'd stood beside me at my wedding in a pale blue dress, crying harder than my own mother. Matthew called around 6. He said a client meeting had run long, that he might not make it home until 8, maybe later. I told him not to worry, that I'd keep the chicken warm. There was nothing unusual in his voice. No tremor. No guilt. Nothing that would have told a smarter woman what was coming. I'd built a career out of reading people under pressure, out of noticing the smallest tell in a subordinate's posture that meant something was wrong. And yet I heard nothing in my own husband's voice. That still sits with me sometimes, the way irony chooses its moments. Emily texted an hour later. She was sorry, she said. Something had come up at the gallery, a shipment of pieces that needed cataloging before a show. She'd make it up to me. She sent a little heart emoji, the kind of thing you'd send someone you loved. I sat alone at my dining table with a chicken I'd basted twice and a bottle of Cabernet I'd been saving, and I told myself this was fine. This was what 45 looked like, sometimes a quiet night, a little disappointment, nothing worth dwelling on. I'd survived worse. I'd survived deployments and funerals and the particular loneliness of command, where you can be surrounded by hundreds of soldiers and still be the only person in the room who can't say what you're actually feeling. A canceled dinner was nothing. It was almost 9 when I noticed Matthew's watch on the entryway table, the one his father had given him, the one he never left the house without. He must have set it down that morning and forgotten it. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, and thought about how he'd panic without it, how he'd probably already noticed it was missing and was annoyed with himself. I decided to bring it to him. He'd mentioned once that late meetings sometimes ran at a coffee shop near Emily's building, the one with good Wi-Fi and bad music. It wasn't far. I told myself I was doing something thoughtful, something a good wife does not, that any part of me suspected what I'd actually find. Emily's apartment building had a keypad entry, but I still remembered the code from years of visiting her, from wine nights and breakups, and the slow unraveling of her second divorce, which I'd sat through with her on her couch more times than I could count. I let myself in and took the elevator up, the watch cool against my palm. I knocked twice. No one answered, but I could hear voices inside, low and easy, the kind of voices that don't expect an audience. I tried the handle. It gave. The door swung open onto her small living room, onto the 2 of them on her couch. Matthew's jacket already off, Emily's hair loose around her shoulders, in a way I'd never seen her wear it, soft. Unguarded, the way you look for someone you're not performing for. They didn't hear me at first. I stood there long enough to understand exactly what I was looking at, long enough that when Matthew finally turned and saw me, there was no scramble, no panic. Just a kind of tired resignation. Like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long. "We've been in love for years," he said. "Not sorry, not ashamed, just factual, the way you'd report weather." Emily didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. She sat up straighter, pulled her cardigan closed, and said the words that would echo in me longer than anything Matthew said that night, that I'd never really known how to be a wife, that I'd given the army everything, and left nothing for him, for us, for this marriage I was apparently too absent to notice was dying. Matthew stood smoothing his shirt and told me he wanted a divorce. He said it like he expected me to fall apart right there on Emily's rug, like he'd already pictured this moment and rehearsed his lines for a woman who would beg. He knew I had no children to hold on to, no family waiting to catch me. He thought that made me fragile. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I reached down, slid the ring from my finger, and set it on Emily's coffee table next to a bowl of decorative stones, the watch beside it. As of today, I said, "You are no longer my responsibility." Then I turned and walked out past the elevator, down the stairs, out into the cold September air, and I didn't look back once. Behind me, I imagine Matthew was already smiling, certain he'd just escaped a marriage to a woman too boring, too absent, too married to her uniform to ever really love him. He had no idea what he'd actually let go of. The divorce moved faster than I expected. Matthew wanted it clean, wanted it quiet, wanted it finished before anyone in his social circle could ask questions he didn't want to answer. I didn't fight him on the house. I didn't want it, not after that night, or on the modest accounts we'd built together. I asked for nothing that would require me to sit across a table from him more than once. My lawyer, a retired JAG officer named Colonel Reyes, who I'd served alongside years earlier, handled most of it without needing much from me beyond a signature. By December it was over. 11 years dissolved in a stack of paperwork that took less time to sign than it had taken me to cook that birthday dinner nobody ate. Matthew married Emily before the year was out. I heard about it secondhand from a cousin who thought I'd want to know, delivered with the kind of careful sympathy people use when they expect you to shatter. I didn't shatter. I remember standing in my kitchen, my new kitchen in a smaller house closer to base, holding my phone and waiting to feel something enormous. What I felt instead was smaller and stranger, a kind of relief. Like setting down a bag I hadn't realized I'd been carrying wrong the whole time. I requested a transfer not long after the divorce was finalized. I told my commanding officer I wanted a change, and he didn't ask why men who'd served long enough usually knew better than to ask a woman why she wanted to move on from something. I ended up at Fort Leavenworth in a role that demanded more of me than anything I'd done before, 12-hour days that bled into 14. Coursework and command responsibilities stacked on top of each other, until there was no room left in my head for a marriage that no longer existed. For the first time in over a decade, there was no one waiting at home to be disappointed when I worked late, no one sighing when a training exercise ran through a weekend, no one making me feel in 100 small, unspoken ways that my career was a hobby I'd taken too seriously. I threw myself into the work the way you throw yourself into water when you're finally allowed to swim instead of tread. I completed the Army's Senior Command Program 18 months later, one of a handful of women in my cohort, and I graduated near the top of my class. My evaluators wrote things about my leadership that I kept folded in a drawer and read only on the hardest nights, not out of vanity, but because some part of me still needed proof that I hadn't imagined my own competence, that Emily's words hadn't been true after all. I was selected for an assignment in Germany, not long after commanding a multinational training element that worked with NATO partners across 3 countries. It was the kind of posting officers spend entire careers hoping for. I remember calling my mother from a hotel room in Stuttgart the night I found out, and she cried on the phone, and I sat on the edge of the bed feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in years, pride uncomplicated and entirely my own. Matthew and Emily, meanwhile, built a life that seemed engineered for an audience. I wasn't looking for their social media, but small towns have long memories and mutual friends who can't help but mention things. Emily posted photos from a beach house they'd bought, captions about starting over with someone who understood her. Matthew, in an interview for some regional business magazine about his company's growth, made an offhand comment about how his ex-wife had chosen the military over a family, how some people just weren't built for partnership. I read it once on a friend's phone and felt nothing but a distant clinical curiosity about how little he understood what he'd actually said. I never responded to any of it. There was nothing to correct, no argument I needed to win. I had learned somewhere in the years of commanding soldiers twice my size and half my patience that the people who need the last word are usually the ones most afraid of the silence that follows it. The years accumulated the way years do when you're working too hard to notice them passing. Germany became Kansas, became the Pentagon, became a joint command post. I can't discuss in detail even now. I was promoted to lieutenant colonel then, 5 years after my divorce, to full colonel 06, a rank that fewer than 1 in 10 officers who commission ever reach. My promotion ceremony was small, mostly colleagues and a few soldiers I'd mentored over the years. Men and women who stood a little straighter when they said my name. My parents drove 6 hours to be there. Matthew was not invited, and it did not occur to me even once to think of him that day. By then, I was commanding a brigade responsible for training thousands of young officers before they moved into their first real assignments. It was demanding, occasionally exhausting work, but it was mine, built entirely by my own hands, out of the wreckage of a marriage I no longer thought about more than a handful of times a year. It was in the middle of that season, steady, full, quietly proud, that the invitation arrived. Cream-colored envelope, my cousin Rachel's looping handwriting on the front. An invitation to her wedding that fall. I hadn't been back to my hometown in almost 2 years. I stood in my kitchen turning the envelope over in my hands, and some instinct I couldn't quite name told me this trip would matter more than a simple family gathering. I had no idea opening that envelope just how right that instinct would turn out to be. I almost didn't go. Weddings had become strange terrain for me, not painful exactly, but complicated, full of relatives who still didn't quite know what to say to a woman who'd been divorced for 5 years and never remarried. But Rachel had been more like a younger sister than a cousin growing up, and I wasn't going to let old discomfort keep me from watching her get married. I flew in 2 days early and stayed with my parents, sleeping in my childhood bedroom under a ceiling I'd stared at as a teenager, dreaming about a life that looked nothing like the one I'd actually built. My mother fussed over what I'd wear, and I told her I already knew a simple navy dress, knee-length elegant, without trying too hard. No uniform. I never wore the uniform to family events unless it was required. My career had never needed an announcement. The morning of the wedding, my mother asked gently if I'd heard that Matthew and Emily might be there. Rachel had grown up around all of us. The families were tangled together through decades of small-town proximity. I told her it didn't matter, and mostly it didn't. 5 years is a long time. I'd built an entire second life since the last time I'd stood in a room with him. The ceremony was held at a restored barn outside town, string lights threaded through the rafters, the late afternoon sun turning everything gold. I sat near the back with my parents, watching Rachel walk down the aisle in a dress that made her look like she was floating, and for a while I forgot to think about anything except how happy I was for her. I saw Matthew during the cocktail hour. He looked older in the way men look older when success has softened them rather than sharpened them, a little heavier. Expensively dressed, the kind of watch on his wrist that costs more than most people's cars. Emily stood beside him in a dress too formal for the venue, her hand resting on his arm, with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to perform contentment for a crowd. He saw me before I saw him fully register. It was me. I watched something shift across his face, surprise, then something closer to satisfaction, like a man checking a box he'd been waiting years to check. He crossed the room with Emily trailing slightly behind him, and I felt my spine straighten out of old habit, the posture of a woman who'd learned long ago never to look smaller than the moment required. "Lauren," he said, like my name was something he was trying out for the first time in a while. "You look well." "Matthew, Emily." I kept my voice, even the same voice I used addressing officers twice my size. Neither of them noticed. He asked what I'd been doing with myself, the question light, almost bored, the way you'd ask someone about a hobby you didn't expect to hear anything interesting about. I told him I was still with the Army, still doing what I'd always done. He nodded like that confirmed something he'd already decided about me years ago. Then he smiled, the smirk I remembered from the worst night of my life, the one that used to make my stomach drop, and now made me feel almost nothing at all, and said the words he must have been saving for exactly this moment. "Leaving you was the best decision I ever made." Emily laughed beside him, a soft, satisfied sound, her hand tightening slightly on his arm. A few relatives standing nearby glanced over, and I could see it land on some of their faces, the quiet assumption that I'd spent 5 years alone while he'd built a beautiful new life, that whatever bitterness lived in this exchange belonged entirely to me. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue. I simply looked at him for a moment, the way I might look at a junior officer who'd said something foolish in front of his peers without realizing it, and let the silence do whatever work it needed to do. He mistook my silence for defeat. Emboldened, he turned slightly toward a cluster of my aunts and uncles standing near the bar and gestured at me with an easy, performative warmth. "My ex-wife," he said, "married to the Army." A ripple of polite, uncomfortable laughter moved through the small crowd. I saw my mother's jaw tighten from across the room. I only smiled, the kind of smile that costs nothing and gives away even less, and reached for a glass of water from a passing tray. I wasn't going to correct him. I'd spent years learning that some people only understand what they've lost when it's standing in a room they can no longer control, and I had a feeling quiet, certain the same instinct that had once told me not to trust a stretch of road in a war zone that looked too calm, that Matthew was about to learn something the hard way. The DJ's voice crackled over the sound system just then, calling the bridal party to gather for the toasts and the traditional entrance of the groomsmen before dinner service began. Matthew turned back toward the dance floor, already losing interest in me, already reaching for another glass of champagne from a passing server. I watched the groomsmen begin filing in through the barn's wide double doors, straightening jackets, adjusting boutonnieres, laughing among themselves the easy way young men do before a formal moment. And then I felt it, a small, strange jolt of recognition, the kind that happens before your conscious mind catches up to what your eyes have already understood. I knew that walk. I knew that posture, the particular way a soldier holds his shoulders, even out of uniform, a habit that never fully leaves you no matter how many years pass or how many weddings you attend in civilian clothes. I looked closer and my breath caught somewhere in my chest. There were 6 groomsmen in total, filing in through the wide barn doors, in their dark suits, laughing and straightening cufflinks the way young men do when they know a room full of people is about to watch them. I recognized the first one almost immediately, Captain Daniel Ruiz, broader through the shoulders than when I'd last seen him, but unmistakably the same young officer I'd mentored through his first company command 4 years earlier. My mind was still catching up to the coincidence when the second face registered, then the third. These weren't strangers who happened to look familiar. These were my officers. Men who had sat across from me in planning sessions, who had briefed me on training exercises at dawn, who had called me ma'am so many times the word had practically become punctuation in my life. Rachel's fiancé Josh, I knew, was a captain in the Army. My family had mentioned it in passing over the years, the way families mention things without connecting them to anything larger. I'd never once put together that his circle of officer friends might overlap with mine. The Army is enormous, but the world of career officers who rise through certain pipelines is smaller than people imagine. Daniel saw me before he reached the front of the room. I watched it happen in real time, his eyes moving across the crowd in the casual, unfocused way of a man scanning a room he doesn't expect to hold anyone significant, and then stopping hard. His whole posture changed in an instant, the loose celebratory ease of a groomsman dropping away, replaced by something automatic and deeply trained, something no amount of champagne or wedding day distraction could override. He straightened to his full height, his chin lifted, his hands, which had been loosely clasped in front of him, moved to his sides. "Good evening, Colonel Phillips," he said, his voice carrying further than he probably intended, cutting cleanly through the low hum of wedding chatter. The second groomsman turned to see what had caught Daniel's attention, and I watched recognition hit him almost as fast. Major Chen. I'd signed his last 2 evaluation reports, myself had personally recommended him for a battalion staff position that had accelerated his career by at least 2 years. He didn't hesitate. "Ma'am," he said, snapping into the same rigid posture, and something in the simple reflexive respect of that single word landed heavier in that barn than any speech could have. Then it happened almost like a wave, one after another, the remaining groomsmen catching on first, confused, then understanding, then falling into the same posture without needing to be told. 6 men in wedding day suits standing at something close to attention in the middle of a barn strung with fairy lights, facing a woman in a simple navy dress they'd only ever known in uniform. The room went quiet in that particular way. Large rooms go quiet, not all at once, but in a spreading hush, conversations dying mid-sentence, as people noticed something was happening and turned to look before they understood what they were looking at. My mother's hand found my father's arm. Rachel, near the front in her wedding dress, went still, her bouquet forgotten at her side. Matthew was still holding his champagne glass, still standing close enough to Emily that his shoulder brushed hers, and I watched confusion cross his face. First, the particular confusion of a man who senses something significant happening, but hasn't yet located himself inside it. It was the youngest of the groomsmen, a first lieutenant named Park, who I remembered as a nervous, promising young officer just 2 years out of West Point, who finally turned toward Matthew directly. He didn't intend disrespect. If anything, his voice carried the earnest, slightly baffled tone of someone stating a fact so obvious he assumed everyone already knew it. "Sir," he said, glancing between Matthew and me, "she's our commanding officer." I have replayed that moment more times than I'd like to admit, not out of vindictiveness, but because of how instantaneously it rearranged everything in that room. Matthew's face didn't just shift, it collapsed, the practiced ease dropping away like a mask that had suddenly stopped fitting. The champagne glass in his hand tilted, and the wine, a deep dark red, spilled forward past his lips, some of it catching in his throat, forcing a cough that sent a fine spray across his own lapel. He sputtered, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and stared at me with an expression I'd never once seen on him in 11 years of marriage. Genuine, unguarded shock. Emily's mouth fell open. She looked at Matthew, then at me, then at the 6 men still standing at attention around us, as though trying to physically locate the version of events she'd believed in for the past 5 years, and finding it nowhere in the room. Around us, the wedding guests who'd known me my whole life. Aunts, uncles, second cousins who'd spent years assuming I was the sad, divorced woman who'd chosen an unglamorous government job over her marriage, were staring at me with an expression I recognized from countless promotion ceremonies. Not pity, something closer to disbelief, and beneath it a slow dawning respect. Josh, the groom, broke the silence first, crossing the space between the wedding party and where I stood with a wide, disbelieving grin, extending his hand toward me, in front of his entire assembled wedding party, his bride and his stunned best man's father-in-law. "Colonel Phillips," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "it is an honor. I had no idea you were Rachel's cousin. Daniel talks about serving under you all the time." Behind him, Matthew stood, frozen wine staining his white shirt, Emily's hand no longer resting on his arm, but hovering somewhere near her own chest as though she needed something to hold on to, and had suddenly found nothing. The rest of the cocktail hour dissolved into something I hadn't expected, a slow, steady stream of people wanting to talk to me, not out of politeness this time, but out of genuine curiosity. My Aunt Carol, who I don't think had asked me a single question about my career in over a decade, suddenly wanted to know what colonel actually meant, how many people I commanded, whether I'd ever been deployed somewhere dangerous. I answered what I could, keeping most of it simple, aware that half the room was still watching me from the corners of their eyes like I'd revealed a second secret identity. Daniel found me near the edge of the dance floor once the initial commotion had settled, his jacket back on his composure, fully restored, though there was still something boyish and delighted in his grin. "I'm sorry if that put you on the spot, ma'am," he said. I wasn't expecting to see you here, of all places." "You didn't do anything wrong, Daniel," I told him. "You just told the truth." He laughed at that, then grew a little more serious. "You saved my career, you know, that review board back when I almost got passed over for captain. You went to bat for me. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for that." I told him he didn't need to, that I'd only done what any decent commander would do for an officer who deserved it. But he shook his head, insisting it wasn't nothing that plenty of commanders wouldn't have bothered. Over the next half hour, similar conversations unfolded in pieces, guests drifting past Groomsman, finding moments to speak with me one at a time. Major Chen told my uncle within earshot of me that I'd personally rewritten a training program that had probably saved lives during a rotation overseas. Details. He was careful to keep general, but the weight of it landed anyway. Lieutenant Park, still slightly pink from his earlier moment of accidental exposure, admitted quietly that most of what he knew about leading soldiers he'd learned from watching how I handled the officers under me steady fare, never raising my voice even when the situation called for it. What none of them said outright, but what became clear through the accumulation of small comments, was this: nearly every man in that wedding party had risen faster, further, or more successfully because of decisions I'd made on their behalf, recommendations I'd written, opportunities I'd fought to secure for them. One of them, Major Reyes, standing near the bar with his wife, was reportedly on the short list for promotion to full colonel himself within the next 2 years. Another was being considered for a position that would likely put him on track for general officer rank, eventually, a rarity that made several relatives' eyebrows lift when Josh mentioned it in passing. I had never told any of these stories myself. I never do. It isn't false modesty, it's simply how I was raised to think about the work. You don't announce what you've built. You let it stand on its own, and if people never ask, that's fine too. But watching my family hear these things secondhand, watching them recalibrate 5 years of assumptions in real time, I understood something I hadn't fully appreciated before. My silence had never protected me from Matthew's version of events. It had simply left the story open for him to write however he wanted. Matthew, for his part, had disappeared from the immediate vicinity, retreating toward a corner near the bar where he could dab at the wine stain on his shirt and avoid the conversations happening around me. I caught glimpses of him throughout the next hour, stiff quiet, nursing a fresh drink, watching the room with an expression I didn't fully recognize on him. He'd always been a man who commanded attention effortlessly, who filled rooms with his voice and his opinions. Now he stood at the margins of one, and I don't think he knew what to do with the unfamiliar feeling of being unnoticed. Emily found excuses to drift toward other conversations, though I noticed she kept glancing back at me with an expression that had shifted from smugness to something more uncertain. At one point she caught my eye across the room, and for just a moment something passed over her face that looked almost like the beginning of shame. It didn't last. She turned away and busied herself with her phone. But I recognized the flicker for what it was, the first crack in a story she'd built her whole sense of superiority on. My mother pulled me aside near the edge of the dance floor, her eyes bright, and asked very quietly why I'd never told them how far I'd risen, how respected I clearly was among the people who actually worked with me every day. "You never asked," I said, not unkindly. And she winced a little at that, because we both knew it was true that for years the family narrative around my divorce had quietly absorbed Matthew's framing the idea that I'd chosen an impersonal career over a warm domestic life, that my solitude was something sad rather than something earned. I didn't need an apology. I wasn't interested in one. What mattered more was watching the story shift in real time. Watching people who loved me finally see the shape of the life I'd actually built, instead of the diminished version Matthew had spent 5 years selling them. Across the room I saw Matthew watching his own reflection in the dark window glass beside the bar, his shoulders slightly slumped, his wine glass now empty in his hand. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I found myself not angry at him, not even particularly satisfied by the reversal happening around us. I only felt quietly that the truth had finally caught up to both of us. Dinner service began not long after the wedding party, seated at a long table near the front, while the rest of us found our places among the round tables scattered across the barn floor. I sat with my parents and an aunt who spent most of the meal asking increasingly detailed questions about brigade command structure, which I answered patiently between bites of a chicken dish that had gone slightly cold in all the commotion. I didn't see Matthew again until well after the toasts had finished, after the cake had been cut, after the DJ had shifted the evening into its looser dance floor phase. I'd stepped outside for air, standing near the barnside entrance where strings of lights gave way to open sky, and the noise of the reception faded into something more distant and manageable. The night had turned cool, the kind of crisp autumn air that used to remind me of early mornings on base boots on gravel, breath visible in the floodlights. I heard the door open behind me and felt before I turned some instinct telling me who it would be. Matthew stood a few feet away. His tie loosened the wine stain on his shirt, now dried into a dark, stubborn shadow he clearly hadn't found a way to address. He looked older out here in the dim light than he had inside, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. I considered saying no. I had nothing left to prove to him, nothing I needed from this conversation. But some part of me, the part that had spent a career learning to hear people out, even when I didn't owe them the courtesy, nodded once and waited. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark field beyond the barn instead of at me. "I didn't know," he finally said, "about any of it. The rank, the command, what you've actually built. I don't think I ever really understood what you did." "You never asked," I said, echoing what I'd told my mother earlier that night, because it was true for him too, more true for him than for anyone. He nodded slowly, accepting that without argument. "Things with Emily haven't been what I thought they'd be," he said, after a pause, the admission coming out stiff, like it cost him something to say it. "The business has been struggling. Half our old friends stopped calling after the divorce, hers mostly. I don't know. I think I assumed leaving would simplify things, make everything better. Maybe I made a mistake," he said finally, and there was something almost boyish in the way he said it, An old habit from the early years of our marriage when he used to admit fault so rarely that I'd learned to recognize the specific weight in his voice when he finally did. I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered because I wanted to be sure of what I said next, wanted it to come from clarity rather than old wounds reopening. "No, Matthew," I said. "You made a choice." He looked at me then, confusion flickering across his face as though he'd expected the admission to soften something in me, to open a door he could walk back through. "There's a difference," I continued. "A mistake is something that happens to you. A choice is something you make deliberately with your eyes open. You didn't stumble into Emily's apartment. You didn't wake up one day already in love with her by accident. You chose for a long time to build something behind my back while I was building something you never once asked about." He didn't argue. I think some part of him had known this was coming, had braced for it the moment he stepped outside. "It was never really the affair that hurt the most," I said, and this part surprised me even as I said it, a truth I hadn't fully articulated to myself until that moment. People make mistakes. Marriages fracture for all kinds of reasons. What hurt was the years before that. The way you talked about my work, like it was something to apologize for. The way you rolled your eyes when I got a promotion, like it was an inconvenience to your schedule instead of something to be proud of. "You never came to a single ceremony, Matthew, not one in 11 years. He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something settle over his face that looked almost like grief, not for us, not for what we'd lost as a couple, but for the years themselves, for the version of himself who hadn't bothered to ask. "I didn't think it mattered that much to you," he said quietly. "You never seemed to need anyone there." "I didn't need anyone there," I said. "That was never the point. The point was that you never wanted to be." He had no answer for that, and I didn't offer him one. There was nothing left to resolve between us, no version of this conversation that would rewrite what had already happened. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had burned itself out years earlier, somewhere between Germany and the Pentagon, replaced by something calmer and more permanent. "I hope things get better for you," I told him, and I meant it in the plain, uncomplicated way you mean well for someone you no longer need anything from. "I hope you find whatever it is you're actually looking for." I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned and walked back toward the warm light and noise of the reception, leaving him standing alone in the cool dark, his shoulders slightly bowed, staring out at a field he wasn't really seeing. I didn't look back to see his expression. I already knew what it would be, the particular stillness of a man finally understanding 5 years too late exactly what he'd thrown away. The wedding ended, the way weddings usually do, slowly, then all at once. The dance floor thinning out, relatives hugging goodbye in the parking lot under a sky gone fully dark, string lights still glowing behind them in the barn windows. I hugged Rachel before I left, told her she looked beautiful, told her Josh seemed like exactly the kind of man who deserved her. She held on to me a little longer than usual and whispered that she was proud of me, words that landed somewhere soft and unguarded in my chest, the kind of thing I didn't realize I'd been waiting years to hear from someone in my family. I flew back to my post 2 days later, back to the rhythm of briefings and inspections and young officers who called me ma'am without ever needing a wedding to teach them how. Life resumed its usual shape quickly, the way it does after moments that feel enormous in the room and smaller with distance. But something had shifted quietly in how my own family spoke to me after that weekend. My mother started asking real questions about my work instead of gently changing the subject. My Aunt Carol sent me an article about women in senior military leadership with a note that just said, "Thinking of you." Small things, but they mattered. Matthew called twice in the weeks that followed. I saw his name on my phone both times and let it ring through to voicemail. I never blocked his number. There was no anger left in me that required that kind of finality, but I also felt no obligation to pick up. Whatever he wanted to say, I suspected, was more for his own benefit than mine, another attempt to settle something inside himself that had nothing to do with me anymore. I let both calls go unanswered, and eventually, they stopped coming. I heard secondhand, the way I heard most things about my old life, that Emily left him early the following year. Apparently the business troubles had worsened, and apparently a marriage built on the shaky foundation of an affair doesn't always hold up well once the excitement fades and the bills start arriving. I felt no satisfaction hearing it. If anything, I felt a distant, uncomplicated sympathy for both of them, honestly, Two people who'd built something on top of a betrayal, and then discovered the way people often do, that a foundation like that rarely holds the weight you need it to carry. My work continued to expand in the months after the wedding. I was asked to sit on a promotion board reviewing candidates for battalion command, an honor that required a level of judgment I didn't take lightly, knowing better than most how much a single fair evaluation could alter the entire trajectory of someone's career. I thought of Daniel sometimes during those long review sessions, of how one decision years earlier had opened a door for him that changed everything downstream. It reminded me why the work mattered beyond rank, beyond ceremony, the simple, steady responsibility of making sure good people got the chances they'd earned. I never remarried. People sometimes ask me about that gently, the way you'd ask someone about an old injury that seems mostly healed. I don't experience it as a wound anymore. I built a life I'm proud of, full of purpose and people who respect me, full of young officers who've gone on to do remarkable things, partly because I fought for them when it mattered. That life doesn't feel incomplete to me simply because it doesn't include a husband. I learned somewhere in the years after Matthew that a full life and a partnered life aren't always the same thing, and I stopped needing them to be. Sometimes late at night, going over paperwork in my office long after everyone else has gone home, I think about that moment at Rachel's wedding. The 6 men standing at attention in their wedding day suits. Matthew's wine spilling down his shirt, the sudden silence that fell over a room full of people who thought they already knew my story. I don't revisit it out of vindictiveness. I think about it because it taught me something I hadn't fully understood before that night. Dignity doesn't need an audience to be real, but sometimes the truth finds its own audience anyway, in its own time, whether you were looking for one or not. I understood something else that night too, something I've carried with me since. Real victory was never about watching Matthew's face collapse when he realized who I'd become. It was never about the wine stain on his shirt, or the stunned silence of relatives who'd underestimated me for years. Those moments were satisfying in the small human way that vindication always is, but they weren't the point. The point was quieter than that. It was the discipline it had taken to keep building year after year without needing anyone's permission or approval to do it. It was choosing not to let Matthew's cruelty define what I believed I deserved. It was walking out of Emily's apartment that night with my ring on the table and my dignity intact, and then simply continuing to walk for 5 years in a direction that was entirely my own. The people who hurt us don't always get a dramatic reckoning. Sometimes they do the way Matthew did that night, but that isn't guaranteed, and it was never something I was owed. What I was owed, what I gave myself, was a life built on my own terms, one where my worth was never contingent on someone else finally noticing it. I think that's the real lesson in a story like this one. Not the wine glass, not the groomsmen standing at attention. The real lesson is quieter, and it belongs to anyone who has ever been made to feel small by someone who should have known better. Sometimes the truth doesn't need you to fight for it. It just needs you to keep living honestly and fully until the day it stands up in a room on its own. I'd love to know where you're watching this from tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know. We share stories like this one every single day, so if this one meant something to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next. Let's keep this journey going together.